I walked into my garage that morning and froze. Every single tool I had collected over decades, my drills, my saws, my prized vintage hammer, was gone. My son had sold them, just like that, without a word, without asking. And the worst part? He stood there smiling, as if it was some harmless joke. That's when something inside me shifted. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I waited, because I knew exactly how I was going to make him feel the way I felt. Powerless, shocked, and completely caught off guard, and I promise, it was worth the wait. I stared at the empty shelves, my hands gripping the edge of the workbench until my knuckles turned white. The smell of sawdust mixed with motor oil hung in the air, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. The shiny drill set I'd spent hours restoring, the vintage hammer my father had given me, the perfectly organized sockets and wrenches, all gone. My son was leaning against the doorway, casual as if he hadn't just robbed me of decades of sweat and memories. "Relax, Dad," he said with that irritating smirk. "They were just old tools. I got a good price for them at the pawn shop." I could hear the coins jangling in his pocket, hear the pride dripping from every word. "A good price?" I managed to whisper, my voice tight with disbelief. "These were priceless." He shrugged, completely unbothered. "Honestly, Dad, you had too many anyway. Why hang on to junk that just collects dust?" Every nerve in my body screamed. The anger bubbled up like hot steam, but I held it in, keeping my voice calm. I didn't want to lose control. Not yet. Not before he realized the cost of what he'd done. I ran my fingers over the empty workbench, imagining the weight of the tools that had been there, imagining the countless projects that would now have to wait or be abandoned. I wanted him to feel the sting of that emptiness, the way I did every time I looked at those bare shelves. And I knew, deep down, that the perfect moment to strike back was coming. I just had to wait. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask you something. What would you do if your own son sold something you'd spent a lifetime building? Would you confront him, scream, or plan something quiet but unforgettable? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see what kind of revenge you dare to take. And if you think I'm about to teach him a lesson he'll never forget, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe too. I've got more stories that prove patience and planning can be the deadliest tools. I still remember the first time I laid my hands on a real set of tools. I was 12, and my father had handed me a small, worn toolbox that had been in our family for generations. I remember the smell of old wood polish and metal. That smell felt like home. That toolbox wasn't just metal and nails, it was history. Every scratch told a story, every dent a lesson learned. My father looked at me and said, "Treat them well, son. One day these will be more than tools. They'll be memories." And I did. I treated every tool as if it were alive. I cleaned them, oiled them, sharpened them. I spent weekends in the garage, teaching myself to build, fix, and create. By the time I was in my 20s, my collection had grown into something remarkable: hammers, wrenches, saws, drills, clamps, and levels. Some were new, some were vintage treasures I'd restored painstakingly. Every piece reminded me of the hours I'd spent learning patience, precision, and persistence. When my own son was born, I hoped he'd share my passion, or at least understand it. I taught him to hold a hammer, to measure twice and cut once, to respect the tools as much as the work they could do. At first, he watched me with wide eyes, nodding along, but it didn't take long for me to notice his attention wandered. He never cared about the details, the care, the pride of finishing a project. Tools, to him, were just things, not memories, not labor, not history. I remember one summer afternoon, I had just finished restoring a vintage saw set I'd found at a flea market. I polished every piece until it gleamed, arranged them neatly on the shelf, and called him over. "Look at this," I said, smiling. "These saws are older than you. They've cut through decades of wood, through generations of work. One day they might teach you something if you're patient enough to listen." He shrugged and walked away to his video games. I was crushed, but I tried not to show it. I told myself that one day he'd understand, that one day he'd see the value in patience, effort, and legacy. That day never came. Over the years, the garage became my sanctuary. It wasn't just a place to work. It was where I remembered who I was and who I wanted to be. The smell of sawdust and oil, the sound of a hammer striking wood, the feel of a perfectly balanced chisel in my hand. These things grounded me. They reminded me that life was built piece by piece and that care and dedication mattered. My son, meanwhile, grew up entitled, used to getting what he wanted without earning it. He treated possessions like disposable items, not as extensions of effort or love. I tried to teach him respect, repeatedly. I warned him, subtly and not so subtly, that there was value in what you worked for. But it was as if my words bounced off a wall. He heard, but he didn't listen. And in my heart, I began to realize something painful. He would never understand the weight of what I'd built, not until it was gone. And that brings us to the morning he sold my tools. Seeing those shelves empty, hearing his casual laughter, I felt the sting of every lesson I'd tried to teach, every story I'd passed down, vanish in a single moment. But somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the hurt, a cold clarity settled over me. I knew what had to be done. I remembered my father's words from decades ago. Every tool, every act, every choice carries weight. One day, someone will learn what that weight really means. I hadn't wanted it to come to this. I had hoped he'd learn naturally, through guidance and example. But he hadn't. And now, the lesson would come in a way he would never forget. I spent the rest of that day quietly inspecting the garage, touching the empty shelves, remembering what had been lost, and imagining what was about to happen. I wasn't angry in the way people think of anger. I was precise, calm, and patient. Like a craftsman preparing a project I was planning. And this project would teach him respect in the only way he would understand, through experience. I can still see him walking out of the house that morning, smug and confident, thinking he had the upper hand. That confidence was beautiful and naive, and I made a mental note to savor the moment when it cracked. Because this wasn't just about tools. It was about every moment of disregard, every careless shrug, every lesson ignored. It was about showing him that what you treat lightly can come back to weigh heavily. I leaned back in my chair, the smell of old wood lingering in my nose, and smiled quietly. Patience had always been my greatest tool, and now it was time to use it. The days after my son sold my tools were worse than I imagined. It wasn't just the loss of things I'd cherished. It was the betrayal, the disrespect, the smugness in his voice when he acted like nothing had happened. Every time I saw him, it was a reminder of how little he valued what I had built. The first complication came the very next week. I had a neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, who ran a small but highly trusted pawn shop. I had gone to him to verify the sale of the tools. It turned out my son had gotten a fraction of what they were worth, practically nothing compared to the memories and craftsmanship they carried. Worse, some of the tools had already been resold to strangers. That meant part of the treasure trove I had restored was gone forever. The injustice gnawed at me, but I didn't act rashly. Patience was key. I spent that evening in the garage, imagining how I could turn the tables. That's when the second complication hit. My son, arrogant and careless, started boasting to his friends about the easy cash he'd made from selling my tools. He didn't stop there. He began flaunting the money, buying gadgets he didn't need, showing off like he'd conquered the world. Watching him parade around with the money that rightfully belonged to my legacy made my blood boil. I could see the envy and amusement in the eyes of his friends, the way they encouraged him. But that only strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about a few tools. It was about teaching him accountability, respect, and consequences. Then came the third complication, his impatience. My son, being impulsive, made a critical mistake. He left receipts, records, and even a note indicating the debt he had incurred when pawning my tools. I realized I could use this to my advantage. The moment wasn't ripe yet, but I started carefully mapping every action he took. His routines, his meetings, his important deadlines, every detail became a piece of the plan. Meanwhile, my friends and family began to notice the tension. Some whispered that I was overreacting, that he was just a young man making mistakes. Others urged caution, warning me not to escalate. But I had learned over a lifetime that true lessons often require a firm hand and timing. I couldn't rely on lectures or confrontation. My son had never listened to those. A minor victory, however, kept me calm. I discovered that the pawnshop's policy allowed for debt transfers and repossessions under certain conditions. That tiny loophole, buried in fine print, became my secret weapon. But I couldn't act immediately. I needed the perfect timing, a moment when the lesson would hit hardest, when he relied on something he took for granted. Throughout this period, I also contended with my own emotions. Anger, yes, but also frustration at myself for failing to instill respect early on. I wrestled with sadness over the tools I could never reclaim, nostalgia for the projects completed in that very garage, and worry that my actions might be seen as petty. Yet, underneath all of that, a sharp clarity emerged. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of anger. It was about justice, about correcting a pattern of entitlement before it became too late. Each day I observed, planned, and waited. I kept my interactions with him polite, even helpful, so as not to arouse suspicion. He would ask me questions about the garage, about old projects, about tools he might want. I answered carefully, masking the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. I even helped him with minor tasks around the house, all the while letting him think he still had the upper hand. By the end of the week, the tension had reached a boiling point, though outwardly everything seemed normal. I could sense him growing more confident, unaware that I had tracked every movement, every financial obligation, every tiny detail he overlooked. The irony was intoxicating. He thought he was clever, but he had laid all the pieces for his own downfall without realizing it. And so, by the 8th day, everything was set. The obstacles, the betrayals, and his arrogance had aligned perfectly. I knew the moment to strike was almost here. But the final complication, the question of timing, would make all the difference. One misstep, and the lesson could lose its impact. I needed precision, patience, and the perfect storm of circumstance. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the faint creak of the old garage door, imagining him rushing off to an event the next morning, completely confident he was untouchable. That confidence, that blind trust in luck and disregard for others' effort, would be his undoing. The stage was set. All I needed now was the opening act, and I intended to make sure he felt every ounce of the lesson he had so carelessly ignored. The day I decided to take action, I didn't rush. I knew better than to act on impulse. Revenge, like any good project, required preparation, patience, and precision. I spent that morning quietly in my garage, running my fingers over the empty shelves where my tools had once rested, imagining the look on his face when the tables turned. Every detail mattered. Every timing choice had to be perfect. I started by reviewing the pawnshop receipts and agreements my son had left carelessly lying around. He had recorded the sale under his own name, leaving an easy trail. That small oversight became my gateway. The pawnshop's contracts included clauses I had once overlooked myself, clauses about debt transfer, collateral repossession, and the legal rights of third-party claimants. It was buried in fine print, but I had spent a lifetime learning to read between the lines. Next, I mapped his schedule meticulously. He had an important meeting early the following morning, one he had been stressing over for weeks. He needed his car for it. That was the key. I noted the times he left the house when he refueled, the exact route he took. Every pattern repeated like clockwork, a rhythm I could exploit. Patience was no longer a virtue. It was a weapon. I called my lawyer in the afternoon, careful not to alarm my son. I explained the situation without mentioning him by name, outlining a hypothetical scenario to see if the debt transfer and repossession could be done discreetly. My lawyer's eyes lit up. Yes, this is legally sound, and timing is everything. That confirmation sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine. Every obstacle I had faced earlier now became a tool in my hands, bending the future to my design. The next step was subtle observation. I visited the neighborhood coffee shop, pretending to read the paper while watching him meet friends and check his phone. He laughed, oblivious, showing off the small gadgets he had bought with the proceeds from my tools. Each careless gesture was another confirmation that he had underestimated me, that he was walking right into the lesson I was preparing. While he basked in his temporary triumph, I quietly completed the necessary paperwork. I arranged for the legal transfer of ownership on the vehicle he relied on, the one he bragged about, polished obsessively, and used as if it were a badge of entitlement. I made sure everything was in place for the next morning, leaving no loopholes, no chance of escape. But I didn't stop there. A key element of this plan was psychological. He needed to feel the impact, the sudden loss, the shock. So I created a series of hints, small, almost imperceptible signs that something was off. The garage door squeaked differently. A shadow moved where it shouldn't. A note that looked innocuous. Each small detail was designed to make him doubt, even briefly, the stability of his world. Suspense was part of the punishment. Even friends and neighbors played unwitting roles. I asked Mr. Caldwell, under the guise of casual conversation, if he could confirm my hypothetical scenario. Would a repossession go unnoticed until the intended moment? Each confirmation was another piece of assurance that the plan would work flawlessly. By nightfall, I had rehearsed every possible contingency. If he called the wrong people, if he panicked, if he tried to circumvent the law, every path had a countermeasure. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was orchestrating a symphony of cause and effect, where his own actions would lead him to the lesson he had ignored for years. And then came the most satisfying part, the final setup. I parked the car exactly where he would expect to find it the next morning, in plain sight, ready for his departure. But thanks to the legal paperwork, it was no longer his to take. The irony was exquisite. He would wake up thinking everything was normal, unaware that the very tool of his freedom, the car he relied on, was now under my control. I sat back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the night settling over the house. The air smelled of oil and wood, of old tools and old patience. I smiled quietly, savoring the tension that was about to reach its peak. Revenge, carefully planned and timed, is a thing of art, and I had spent years perfecting my craft. I knew that tomorrow morning the world he had taken for granted would tilt in a way he couldn't ignore. Every step he had taken to assert control, every careless gesture, every boastful laugh, all of it would culminate in one moment. And in that moment, he would understand what it truly meant to underestimate the quiet patience of a man who had spent a lifetime building, restoring, and protecting what mattered. The morning arrived crisp and quiet, the kind of morning that smells faintly of dew and possibility. I had risen early, as always, to enjoy the calm before the storm. But this day, the calm was not for me alone. It was for the lesson my son was about to learn. I watched from the window as he shuffled into the driveway, phone in hand, coffee in the other, clearly running through his usual checklist. He moved with the confidence of a man who believes the world bends to his convenience. He opened the garage door, and his eyes flicked to the car, parked perfectly, as if waiting for him. For a split second, I saw that smug sense of entitlement in his expression. Then he tried to get in. The key wouldn't turn. The engine didn't respond. At first he muttered, a little annoyed, thinking it was a minor glitch. "Battery?" he asked himself, tapping the ignition. When nothing happened, he leaned closer, frowning, fumbling for his phone to call for help. And that's when reality hit him. The vehicle had been legally transferred. The paperwork was complete. The car, the very thing he relied on as a symbol of freedom and success, was no longer his. It was mine, and I hadn't even left the house. I watched through the window as the color drained from his face. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was some mistake, some prank. But every failed attempt at starting the car tightened the invisible noose I had been weaving for weeks. Panic began to replace arrogance. He looked around, desperately searching for me, probably imagining some technical fault, some intervention. I stepped outside casually, coffee in hand, wearing the calm, deliberate expression of a man who has done nothing wrong. "Having trouble with the car?" I asked innocently. His eyes widened, jaw tightening, as if he had expected any answer other than this one. "Dad, what did you do?" he stammered, voice rising, a mixture of disbelief and fear. "I merely reminded you," I said softly, letting each word sink in, "that some things aren't yours to take, sell, or underestimate, including my tools, and apparently not even your car." The shock on his face was exquisite. He took a step back, as if the ground beneath him had suddenly shifted. I could see his mind racing. "How? Why? This isn't possible." All the while, the realization deepened. Every careless action he had taken, every boast, every act of disrespect, had led him here. Then came the calls to friends, frantic explanations, desperate attempts at logic, all of which fell flat. The legality of the transfer, the paperwork, the methodical timing, nothing could be undone immediately. He was trapped in the consequences of his own arrogance. I let him stew, pacing the driveway, each step echoing his panic. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about clarity. He needed to feel the weight of his actions, the sudden absence of what he took for granted. Every argument he tried, every appeal, met with the calm, deliberate reasoning of a man who had anticipated each move. Finally, he turned to me, exasperated. "But the tools, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to respect what wasn't yours," I interrupted gently. "But intention isn't always enough. Actions carry consequences, and some lessons need to be learned the hard way." I handed him a folder containing copies of all the legal documents, pawn slips, transfer forms, debt confirmations, everything that proved my preparation, my foresight, and, more importantly, his negligence. His face drained further as he read, the full weight of his misjudgment finally sinking in. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had sold my tools to feel powerful, to gain freedom, and here he was, immobilized, utterly dependent, facing the reality that his impulsive decisions could backfire catastrophically. I could almost hear the echoes of all the times he had laughed at my advice, ignored my warnings, and taken shortcuts in life. Every mockery, every careless grin, had paved the road to this moment. He finally sank to the curb, head in his hands, overwhelmed, defeated. I stayed quiet, letting him sit in the discomfort he had earned. No shouting, no dramatics, just the steady, unyielding presence of someone who had spent a lifetime building patience and knowledge. After a few long moments, I knelt beside him and said quietly, "I don't want to ruin you. I want you to understand. Respect what others have worked for. Value trust. And never assume that small actions have no consequences." He looked up at me, tears of frustration welling in his eyes, and for the first time, I saw understanding, a flicker of respect that had been missing for years. Not just fear, not just embarrassment, but comprehension of the lesson embedded in every carefully orchestrated detail of my plan. I smiled softly, helped him up, and added, "Next time, think twice before selling what isn't yours. Life has a way of returning favors, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a bang." The lesson was delivered, the satisfaction complete, and the irony of it all, him losing control over the very thing he considered power, made the morning unforgettable. The morning storm had passed, leaving a silence that felt heavier than words. My son sat quietly, finally seeing the consequences of his actions without interruption or excuse. I didn't need to lecture him further. The lesson had landed, sharp and undeniable. He now understood what it meant to cross boundaries, to underestimate someone who had spent a lifetime building, protecting, and teaching. I returned to my garage, running my fingers along the shelves that once held my tools, imagining them restored to their rightful place. There was satisfaction in the quiet, in knowing that respect had been demanded without shouting, without destruction, just precision, patience, and inevitability. As he watched from the driveway, humbled and thoughtful, I smiled and said softly, "Sometimes the greatest power isn't in taking, but in waiting, and knowing exactly when to act." And that, more than anything, ensured the lesson would never be forgotten.